Hello, history buffs, time travelers, and scholars. World War II wasn't just battles and strategies. It revealed the darkest sides of humanity. Unspeakable acts of cruelty, chilling experiments, and unimaginable suffering unfolded during this time. The dark side of World War II, unspoken atrocities. World War II was marked by widespread violence and devastation, but one of its most harrowing aspects was the systemic sexual violence that occurred on a staggering scale. This dark chapter involved not only the Axis powers, but also, in some cases, the Allied forces, exposing the horrifying realities of war. In Nazi Germany, sexual violence was used as a deliberate weapon of oppression, particularly during the Holocaust. Women and girls, especially those imprisoned in concentration camps or ghettos, were subjected to calculated abuse aimed at stripping them of their dignity and humanity. Under Heinrich Himmler's orders, brothels were established within concentration camps and Nazi-occupied territories. These facilities, falsely presented as rewards for compliant prisoners and soldiers, were centers of coercion where women were forced into sexual slavery, constantly living under the threat of violence and death. Beyond the concentration camps, the Axis powers used sexual violence as a tool to terrorize and control occupied populations. In Asia, the Japanese military's infamous comfort women system enslaved tens of thousands of women, forcing them into servitude for soldiers. These women endured unimaginable suffering, their trauma ignored for decades after the war. Shockingly, some instances of sexual violence were also committed by Allied forces in liberated territories. In regions like France and Germany, a small number of Allied soldiers engaged in acts that betrayed the principles they claimed to fight for, casting a shadow over their role as liberators. For the victims, the physical and psychological scars of this abuse endured long after the war. Many survivors faced stigma and silence, their stories suppressed or ignored by society. The acknowledgement of these atrocities is crucial not only for understanding the full scope of World War II, but also for ensuring such horrors are never repeated. War often brings out the worst in humanity, and the sexual violence of World War II serves as a stark reminder of how deeply the consequences of conflict can scar individuals and societies. These stories demand to be told, not to tarnish history, but to honor the victims and learn from the past. If you believe these important truths deserve to be shared, don't forget to like and subscribe, as your support helps us continue shedding light on these untold stories. The fall and liberation of France. On the morning of September 1st, 1939, the world was thrown into turmoil as German forces launched an unprovoked and sudden invasion of Poland. Using a devastating new military strategy called Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, the Nazis attacked with unmatched speed and force. Dive bombers screamed through the skies, tanks fired relentlessly, and fast-moving infantry crossed the borders with precision, leaving Poland struggling to defend itself. Within weeks, the Polish army was overrun, and the country fell under German control. The invasion of Poland prompted France and Great Britain to declare war on Germany, realizing too late the scale of Adolf Hitler's ambitions. After a tense winter in 1939 and early 1940, Germany launched its next offensive in the spring, targeting the Low Countries and France. Weary from the First World War and unprepared for Germany's swift and calculated moves, French defenses were quickly overwhelmed. German forces pushed deep into the French countryside, and by June 1940, they had reached the outskirts of Paris. Despite pockets of brave resistance, such as the evacuation at Dunkirk, where Allied troops managed to escape, France was forced to surrender within 6 weeks. The nation endured 4 long years under the oppressive control of Nazi occupation. While Nazi forces were gradually pushed back by Russian troops in the east and Allied forces in Africa and southern Europe, France remained under German control until June 6, 1944, D-Day. The darkest chapter of World War II. Systemic violence. During World War II, the horrors of war extended far beyond the battlefield, encompassing a sinister campaign of sexual violence that often remains overlooked in history. Women from occupied territories, political dissidents, and marginalized communities bore the brunt of these atrocities, enduring systemic abuse under regimes that sought to dehumanize them entirely. In Nazi-occupied territories, brothels were established under the guise of rest and recreation centers for soldiers. These facilities, intended to boost morale, instead became hubs of forced sexual servitude. Women selected for these brothels were subjected to humiliating and invasive inspections to meet the Nazis' disturbing criteria of physical perfection. The selection process was ruthless, prioritizing youth and appearance. While Jewish women were deliberately excluded due to racial ideologies, non-Jewish women from occupied territories, often from marginalized or vulnerable backgrounds, were treated as expendable objects. Degrading medical examinations reduced them to commodities, their bodies cataloged like livestock. The violence and exploitation did not end with physical abuse. It extended to the psychological, as these women were forced into cycles of systematic dehumanization, their dignity stripped away. Particularly harrowing was the plight of Spanish women deported after the Spanish Civil War. Many were political dissidents or supporters of the Republican side. Once imprisoned in Nazi concentration camps, they endured the same brutal selection and abuse as others. These women, caught between the violence of two oppressive regimes, became some of the war's most vulnerable victims. Even after the fall of the Nazi regime, the liberation of occupied territories brought mixed outcomes for women. For instance, the 1944 liberation of France was a moment of hope, but also revealed darker truths. Allied forces, particularly American soldiers influenced by media depictions of France as a land of liberated women, committed acts of sexual violence against the very people they came to save. Publications like Stars and Stripes perpetuated fantasies of French women as sexually available, fostering a culture that excused abuse under the guise of celebration and gratitude. This systemic violence was not limited to one nation or group. It was a symptom of the broader dehumanization that war fosters. The stories of these women are often overshadowed by the larger narrative of World War II, but are integral to understanding the full scope of its atrocities. Their suffering highlights the profound impact of war on civilians, particularly women, who endured unimaginable hardships in the shadows of history. The silence surrounding these atrocities must be broken. Recognizing and documenting these stories is crucial not only for honoring the victims, but also for ensuring such crimes are never repeated. As Allied forces began their invasion of France in June 1944, the focus was on military objectives, but soon reports of widespread sexual violence emerged. What was supposed to be a moment of liberation for these women quickly turned into a nightmare. Many women, from young girls to elderly women, were victims of mass assaults. Soldiers rationalized their actions as a form of revenge, or saw themselves as entitled to partake in the spoils of war. The scale of the violence was massive and affected entire communities. The justice system was slow and ineffective in holding perpetrators accountable, with only a small number of soldiers tried and punished for their crimes. Even though investigations were conducted, the true number of incidents remains unclear, as many victims either feared retaliation or were too ashamed to come forward. Hidden atrocities, the reluctance to confront post-WW2 crimes. The reluctance to confront the crimes committed by Allied forces in the aftermath of World War II was largely rooted in the desire to protect their image as the liberators of Europe. After years of brutal conflict, the Allies had successfully defeated Nazi Germany, and the post-war world was eager to embrace the narrative of their heroism. The Allies were viewed as the saviors who had freed occupied nations, and acknowledging their wrongdoings would have complicated that image. This led to the suppression of uncomfortable truths, with many atrocities committed by Allied soldiers, especially sexual violence against women, being downplayed or completely ignored. The voices of the survivors of these crimes were often silenced, leaving their stories hidden for decades. The historical memory of World War II became selectively shaped, with the atrocities of the Axis powers receiving much of the focus, while the actions of the victorious Allies were minimized or erased from mainstream discourse. It was not until historians like Robert Lilly and Mary Louise Roberts began to investigate overlooked sources and records that the full extent of these abuses started to come to light. These historians delved into previously untold stories, piecing together the truth from survivor accounts and military records that had long been suppressed. Their work revealed the widespread nature of the violence committed by Allied soldiers, particularly in the liberated territories. In France and other regions freed from Nazi occupation, many women were subjected to sexual violence by the very soldiers who were meant to protect them. The sense of liberation quickly turned into a nightmare for countless women, as soldiers, emboldened by a sense of entitlement, exploited the situation for their own gratification. The perpetrators often justified their actions by viewing them as a form of reparations for the suffering they had endured during the war, or by embracing the mindset that, as victors, they had the right to claim the spoils of war. This mindset was not only widespread, but deeply ingrained among many soldiers who believed that the women in liberated territories owed them gratitude for their newfound freedom. This belief blurred the lines between liberation and exploitation, with women's bodies becoming battlefields of a different kind. The violence was not random. It followed a clear pattern, affecting women of all ages, from young girls to the elderly. In some cases, even children were victims. The scale of the abuse was staggering, and entire villages and communities were left reeling from the trauma. Despite the extent of the crimes, however, only a small fraction of the perpetrators were held accountable. The U.S. military investigated some cases, but the number of soldiers prosecuted was shockingly low in comparison to the scale of the violence. Of the 139 soldiers tried for sexual violence, only 68 were sentenced to life imprisonment, and just 22 were executed. These numbers were a mere fraction of the actual incidents, many of which went unreported due to fear of retaliation or shame. The post-war reluctance to confront these crimes was also tied to the desire to maintain the image of the Allies as virtuous liberators. Acknowledging the crimes committed by their own forces would have undermined this image. So many of the abuses were covered up, and the suffering of the survivors was ignored. This selective historical memory persisted for decades, with the focus primarily on the atrocities of the Axis powers. It wasn't until later generations of historians like Lilly and Roberts began to uncover and highlight these stories that the full scope of the sexual violence and exploitation came into public awareness. Their work helped to bring attention to a hidden aspect of the war that had been silenced for far too long. Meanwhile, as Soviet forces advanced towards Berlin in the final months of the war, their treatment of German civilians, particularly women, became one of the most brutal episodes of the conflict. The Red Army's advance was often portrayed as a triumphant march toward victory, but for millions of women living in the territories they occupied, it was a terrifying and violent reality. The Soviet soldiers, driven by a desire for revenge for the immense suffering caused by the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, used sexual violence as both a weapon of war and a form of retribution. The memory of the horrific Nazi assault on Soviet soil in 1941, which resulted in millions of deaths and widespread destruction, fueled the anger and aggression of Soviet forces. As they approached Berlin in early 1945, this desire for vengeance was manifested in the widespread abuse of German women, who were seen as the enemy's spoils. This dark chapter in the war remained hidden for many years, overshadowed by the larger narrative of Allied victory, but it stands as one of the most harrowing and overlooked episodes of World War II. In Berlin alone, it is estimated that between 95,000 and 130,000 women were assaulted during the chaotic weeks leading up to and following the city's fall in May 1945. This staggering number represents a significant portion of the city's female population and is just a glimpse of the broader tragedy that unfolded across the occupied territories. The full scope of the violence is even more shocking when we consider that it is estimated between 860,000 and 1.4 million women across Germany and Eastern Europe suffered at the hands of Soviet soldiers. The actions of Soviet soldiers were driven by a deep sense of revenge for the horrific Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, which had resulted in millions of deaths and the destruction of entire cities. This revenge was compounded by the belief that German civilians, particularly women, were complicit in the atrocities of the Nazi regime. As we wrap up this difficult and important topic, it's clear that wartime violence can leave scars that last for generations. The tragic events during the end of World War II are a painful reminder of how the horrors of conflict can affect innocent civilians in unimaginable ways. If you found this information eye-opening, please take a moment to like and subscribe for more deep dives into history's darkest chapters. Your support means a lot, and we look forward to bringing you more insightful content in the future. Thanks for watching, and take care.